Hello and welcome back to the channel. In recent days I have been struck by a very interesting contradiction, and that contradiction is that I have observed that those people who identify themselves as being left-wing in British politics will label the Conservatives as the hard right, whilst those who are actually on the right of centre of British politics, sometimes former or current members of the Conservative Party, are identifying the Conservative Party as socialist. So this is quite an amusing contradiction, and I wanted to explore that. I want to have a bit of a discussion on which group is right. What are the Conservatives? Are they really left or right wing? Does that even matter anymore? Now, just as a bit of disclaimer here, I myself identify as independent. I try not to align to any particular political ideology, left or right. That is a personal choice that I have made a long time ago. And in the interest of balance, I will do a video later on the Labour Party, following along similar lines to this discussion on the Conservatives. But for now, I want to talk about the Conservative Party. Apart from being more interesting and more challenging, it is also more important, because they are the party in charge of the UK government at this point. And whilst the UK is in a weekend of celebrating the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, and with all the changes going on and with all the political turmoil that's going on, now it's actually a very good time for a bit of introspection, a bit of analysis. It's what sort of country does the UK want to be? How does it want to identify itself? That's on the wider context. On a perhaps narrower, more specific context, and perhaps more relevant to this channel, is that if you are a political leader, whether in the EU or the US or any other country, and you are trying to negotiate something with the UK government led by the Conservatives, then as a political leader, you want to be able to put Conservative policies or UK government policies into a category, because that helps you to understand the context in which you're negotiating and perhaps the influences, the things that interest the other side that you can use to your advantage when you're trying to negotiate something with them. So this is a very useful thing to do. Now, I'm always a bit wary of putting anybody into categories. No one ever fits neatly into them. But this sort of thing is important when you're trying to negotiate at government level, because you're trying to understand what influence you can bear on the other side and how you can influence them to meet your objectives. So let's have a little look into this. Let's have a discussion about what the Conservative Party are and what that means. So let's start by advocating the case that the Conservatives are a hard right political party. So we can look at various policies that they have, and there are certain clear themes that come through. So, for example, the Conservatives very much have the belief of trimming the state, of a smaller government rather than a larger government. And even though they may fail to achieve this on various occasions for various reasons, that is still an ideology that they actually have. And this is clearly stated by various leaders or MPs in the Conservative Party. So in that context, they're most definitely right of centre. They also have a strong belief in free market principles. Again, that is advocated to right of centre parties. They also have the desired, the anti-immigration policies. Now, this is not exclusively a right of centre type thing, but it certainly is more traditionally associated with more right-wing parties. And it certainly has to be said that the current Conservative Party advocate very strong anti-immigration policies, and the stronger those policies, the more right the parties tend to be. So in that sense, perhaps we can make a reasonable argument that the Conservatives are veering into hard right rather than centre right territory. They also have reduced regulations, a very traditional Conservative staple. And they have policies very much geared towards trying to increase employment and very significantly reduce the welfare state. Now on this one, while this would normally be centre-right traditional Conservative type policy, the reality is that the way they implement it veers more towards hard right, particularly their treatment of vulnerable people, those on welfare, apart from pensioners of course, but those on welfare has been quite shocking actually, just how awful they've treated them. So in that context they're a little bit more extreme than the usual. So across the board we would say that the Conservatives are right of centre, and I don't think they would disagree with that. But it's an interesting question of where do we draw the line at saying they're hard right. And I would say that the strongest evidence for this is their anti-immigration policies, and the way that they really want a small state. But having said that, there are hard right parties that tend to advocate quite bigger states, so that's not particularly conclusive. So I would lean more toward Conservative welfare and anti-immigration policies as the evidence that they are more right of centre than has traditionally been the case. So let's look at the counter-argument. Let's see how can we identify the Conservatives as being a socialist party, particularly those who are strong advocates of Brexit and who identify as fairly libertarian or right-wing. They seem to be making this argument that Conservatives have become or implemented what they consider to be a very socialist state. And the most obvious evidence for this is the phenomenal amount of expenditure that the Conservative Party has had to do in the last couple of years. So particularly on furlough scheme and supporting businesses and individuals, the amount of money they've actually spent. Now there's a bit of a contradiction here, because I describe them as a small state party, yet one that seems to spend an insane amount of money. And you can have both. And this is the reality of what the Conservatives are doing, is they're trying to strip money away from government departments, away from the way civil servants would spend it on programmes, on infrastructure and so on, and funnel it directly to companies or to individuals. But that doesn't mean, in this particular case, that it might be small state in terms of governance, but it's not small state in terms of expenditure. And on this one, more by accident rather than intent, I'm sure, the Conservative Party are actually spending a sum of money that would be traditionally associated with very left-wing and socialist parties, which is quite funny. And this is perhaps the best argument that those have, that the Conservatives are practicing socialism. There's a little bit more though, and there's been lots of talk of the levelling up agenda, particularly promoted by Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. And this actually is not really a traditional Conservative policy at all. This is much more left of centre. This is the belief that you need to equalise individuals. And that sort of philosophy and thinking is very much associated with more left-wing parties. And the Conservatives have gone at it with a big way. And obviously they've got a catchy title, the levelling up agenda. Now there's lots of arguments that can be made here. People will make the argument that the Conservatives are not genuine. This is a political gimmick to obtain working class votes, because the reality is in the UK political system, if the working class vote does actually represent the majority. So even if the Conservatives are genuinely hard right and don't give a damn about the working class, as some people advocate, then they still need to play the game. They need to pretend they do. And so they argue that the levelling up agenda is part of that theme. On the other hand, you could take the view that they genuinely are trying to improve the country. They're trying to reduce disproportionate expenditure and investment, in the South in particular. You can argue this is done for political expediency, or you can argue that they've done it on moral grounds. Take your pick. But either way, this is a policy, a strong, firm, central policy of the Conservative Party that is more left to centre than right. We can also see, and again this has been a bit amusing, is that there's been strong play by the Conservative Party of full employment. Now the reality is that those who believe in free market principles and those who identify as right of centre, they tend to understand that in economic terms you cannot have full employment. You've always got to have a certain number of unemployment because that is the way economies work. If you have too much employment, you create inflation and friction within the economic system. So advocating full employment or any type of full employment type policy has definitely traditionally very much been associated with the left wing, not the right. So now, again, you make an argument that this is just for political expediency, that they're talking up full employment, which they didn't intend to achieve, because it sounds good. And there's lots of holes, of course, in the argument. There's lots of manipulation of the statistics to suit the political argument. But for now, let's say that this is a little bit of a socialist style policy of going for full employment. We also have a very high focus on the working class. Now, I've spoken about this already, but the reality is the Conservative Party traditionally has been associated with more the landed gentry, more the well-to-do middle class, if you like. But of course, for anyone to win elections, they have to secure broad party, broad political support from all classes. So you can go two ways on this. You can take the view that the current Conservative Party are very focused on the working class as a means of improving their electoral base, and we've seen this with the Republican Party in the US as well. And traditionally that sort of focus is more on the left of the political spectrum. But then you can also argue that this is just good politics or sensible politics, and that it doesn't actually matter whether you're left or right, you should still be advocating policies and a focus on the working class because that's where the numbers of votes are. And there's plenty of argument to contradict this as well with the way that the UK, especially Conservatives, tend to support very wealthy individuals who coincidentally happen to be donors to the Conservative Party. But of course the best bit I can put is right at the end. It's the windfall tax. And for all the argument and all the reluctance to do so, the Conservative Party is actually going to impose a windfall tax on the oil companies in order to deal with the cost of living crisis. And this is very much seen as a policy that would be strongly advocated by left-wing parties. And yet here we have the Conservative Party implementing it. So this, I think, is perhaps the straw that broke the camel's back, where those who identify themselves as fairly right of the centre, that the Conservatives are implementing this windfall tax, which is very much against their free market principles and philosophy. So do we look at all this and do we come to a view that the Conservatives are perhaps more socialist than they are right-wing? Well, not so fast, I don't think. There's a bit more. There's a few more things I think we want to look at, which shape the context. I mean, one thing we can see is rampant corruption. The current Conservative Party, or the current UK government, I suppose, is appallingly corrupt. It is quite astonishing that they can get away with it. And this actually had nothing to do with left or right-wing alignment. But it's worth mentioning this because this tends to shape political discourse and political thinking. So the Conservative Party, in corruption rots, that's one, and it spreads. That's one of the things you always have to remember about corruption. It corrupts everything. So it goes from the head all the way down. And by being a very visibly corrupt political party, it not only corruption in terms of the financial sense, but also in the ideological sense. If they have no principles, if you like, when it comes to money, then why would they have principles when it comes to political ideology? Can go the argument. So in this context, it's going to be very hard to really label them as, hard right or socialist, because they're too corrupt for that to apply very clearly. So that's the first point I want to make. The next point, of course, is they have pathological desire to tell untruth at this point in time. So you can call that propaganda, you can call that sheer lying, political manipulation, whatever phrase you want to use. But along with the corruption has also come a political party that is very, very reluctant to be honest with the electorate. And when you have a political party that's reluctant to be honest, with the electorate, then you tend to find, again, like corruption, it spreads, and it can also infect the ideology as well. So as a consequence, the Conservative Party will be lying to itself as much as it will be lying to the electorate and to the body politic, as it were. And that also has to be borne in mind, that they are deceiving themselves as much as they're deceiving anyone else. And this is an important thing to stress as a negotiator. This is why I talked at the very beginning about trying to fit them into a category. Because when you're negotiating with someone, it doesn't matter what they identify themselves at. If their motivations are different from what they say, if they are deceiving themselves, then you as a negotiator will want to recognize that. Because critical to being successful at negotiation is getting to the underlying truth of the matter. So the fact that we have the Conservative Party very much lying to itself as well as to everyone else, when you're negotiating with them, you have to bear that in mind, and you cannot accept their statements at face value. And this is part of the problem they're having with their negotiations with countries like the US and the EU. They've already recognised this, and so they will not accept Conservative negotiators' statements or positions at face value because they do not believe it is truthful. What else can we talk about when it comes to the political alignment of the Conservative Party? Well, there's definitely a strong trend at the moment towards nationalism and rapping or flag waving. And, all parties do this. It doesn't matter about political alignment. But there's been a noticeable shift in recent years when, particularly under Boris Johnson, the Conservative Party have really gone out with this. And this is a dangerous political game that bad political leaders tend to play. They like to cover up all their weaknesses. They like to try and create a sense of tribalism, of coherence, by making people feel patriotic, nationalistic, and whatever. And we're seeing an awful lot of that at the moment from the Conservative Party. Now, for those perhaps not fully aware of British culture, British people as a rule are not actually particularly comfortable with flag waving. I'm not talking about at sporting events when you're supporting a football team, and I'm also not talking about Scotland and Wales, which actually have a much stronger and more comfortable relationship with waving the flag and expressing a nationalistic sentiment. But in England per se itself, they are not comfortable with that. And the main reason for that is it's very much perceived as something that unscrupulous people do, particularly leaders and Nazis, for example, were horrendous, massive flag wavers. So that memory still lingers within British popular culture. So that's one of perhaps the barriers that the Conservatives face, is that the British are not comfortable with all that flag waving, and yet it's being thrust upon them relentlessly as a sort of political tool. There's also something else going on, which has been dubbed the culture war, or anti-woke, or whatever other phrasing they want to use. And this itself is also significant, because when any political party start to engage in this sort of behaviour and messaging, this is when they start to try and create generational changes and societal changes. They're not there just to do politics and to run a government. By engaging in any kind of cultural war, they're trying to shift the entirety of society, the way people think. So let's perhaps use a more benign example. When Tony Blair and the Labour Party were in charge, they wanted to shift the UK electorate into being more tolerant, a more decent society, particularly when it came to dealing with people who are gay, for example, or of different ethnic minorities. So I wouldn't go so far to call it a culture war. That's more applicable to what the Conservative Party and they themselves call. But what I'm pointing out is that all political parties like to do gradual shifts in the way society thinks and approaches issues. So for Labour, it was things like, gender, ethnic minorities and gay rights. For the Conservatives, it seems to be something very different. And they seem to call it woke or anti-woke and so on. And they're also in danger a little bit of imitating Trump's messaging, or identifying anyone who disagreed with them as hard left or liberal or whatever else. And this very much fits into their pattern and their narrative of conducting a culture war to shift the electorate. So you could argue, certainly if you're left or centre, that what the culture war is really about is making the UK population as a whole more right-wing, and thus in the future more likely to vote Conservative. So they're trying to shift the whole country right of centre, if you like, through, manipulation, behavioural science, whatever techniques that they wish to use. And I've spoken before about their strong anti-immigration focus. And the reality is that you can have a anti-immigration thing that is government policy, that's just politics and based on certain factors. But what is certainly quite easy to argue is that the way the Conservative Party has argued along anti-immigration lines has been much more racist, I suppose, and discriminatory. Disproportionately against people of colour. That's the impact of their policies. And there's an awful lot of British people that, whether they vote Conservative or otherwise, are going to be extremely uncomfortable with these policies pushed forward by the Conservative Party. They appeal to a fairly small minority of the British electorate. That is a minority I will talk about a bit more later. But for now, we have quite a nationalistic party that I wouldn't go so far as to say promoting whiteness in the UK, but are definitely promoting an us and them more often than not are immigrants. And that is the messaging that the Conservative Party is pushing forward these days. So, which is going to make, lots of people uncomfortable. So my final point here, and this is really disturbing, the most disturbing point of all perhaps, and that's something that doesn't get enough press coverage, that the Conservative Party are dismantling some of the institutions of British democracy. So we're talking about the independence of the judges, we're talking about the way Parliament works, the way the media works perhaps. The Human Rights Act, the desire to remove the Human Rights Act, the desire to deport people, strong anti-immigration policies, in defiance of UK and international laws and so on. And the Conservative Party are doing this because they don't like the obstacles that those institutions, those regulations, those rules present to them, their ability to do the things that they feel they want to do. And Brexit is very much a part of this whole point. They wanted to remove the UK from the EU because they did not like the way that the EU imposed conditions and restrictions upon their ability to exercise complete power within British politics. And this is an extremely disturbing trend. This is a trend where political reform is one thing. Making things better is what all political parties strive to do. But making things worse or weaker so that you can exercise more power is a very slippery slope. And so when you look at quite a large number of Conservative policies and the things that they intend to do, the primary objective of all of those is weakening opposition to themselves. Even conducting, electoral boundary changes, for example. The culture war, the way they spend money, the way that's being allocated, anything like that. The way they're defunding the police, defunding the court system and so on, and trying to stop senior judges from being able to challenge government decisions. All of that is a move towards reduced democracy. And that has been a whole trend of the Conservative Party in recent years, ever since the Brexit referendum result. Whilst they might talk about improving democracy and taking back control, when you look at all the policies in the main that they have implemented, it is all about a consistent pattern of reducing democracy, reducing democratic checks and balances. So that is something I think we can make a strong argument to pin on the Conservative Party. So we come to this question of, what are the Conservative Party really? Having said all that, what do they actually represent? What sort of category can we put them in? And I'll come to that in a bit. But the first point I want to make is that the Conservative Party of today is a very different Conservative Party that existed 10 or even 5 years ago. That Conservative Party was right of centre, believed in free market, even legalised gay marriage, all that sort of stuff. This Conservative Party had very different policies, very different objectives, and a very different narrative from the traditional Conservative Party. And you can see that in the fact that so many of the people that you would identify as traditional Conservatives, take John Major, take Heseltine, take Rory Stewart, and a whole host of others that I'm not going to bother to name, all of those have been kicked out or left the Conservative Party. And all of those are associated with traditional conservatism. So what you have now is a new breed of Conservatives who are more strident and who appear to be more right-wing. But not just right-wing, but also has a very different political shift. Some of that would have already covered. They seem to be thinking, well, so we can't really identify them so easily. Do we consider them that perhaps they are social democrats? Well, I find that quite a laughable thought, really. I know some people might try and make that case because of some of the more socialist policies they've implemented, but that just doesn't seem to fit at all. But they do promote nationalism. That is quite clear. They do tend to be big state spenders, which is very much in contradiction to traditional conservative values. They do seem to be more than a shade of racist in their policies. And so this is a key point that I perhaps ought to make, that the Conservative Party today, politically speaking, is more aligned to the policies that would have been advocated by the British National Party 10 years ago. The anti-immigration focus, the tribalism, us and them, the flag waving. The Conservative Party of 10 years ago would not have dreamt of doing any of that. They wouldn't have liked it. They would not have been comfortable with it. The BNP, of course, would have loved it. So this is a bit of a dilemma for those who consider themselves traditional conservatives, that they might vote Conservative out of habit, but they will be perhaps subconsciously or consciously aware that the Conservative Party, they're effectively voting something that's a lot closer to the British National Party than I imagine they're comfortable with. Whether they hold their nose and carry on voting, or whether they recognise that and switch their votes, will be an interesting question in the months and years to come. So with that said, what category can we put the Conservative Party in? And this is actually, I find, quite difficult, to be honest. I mean, do we call them ultra-conservative? In some cases you might, but there are quite a lot of cases where you can't, particularly the way they spent so much money on furlough and propping up the economy and the levelling up agenda and so on. These are not ultra-conservative style policies. What the academics perhaps would describe them as is socially conservative and fiscally liberal. That's not a political category or term, but is that a description we can apply to conservatives? And again, I don't think that fits very neatly. Perhaps we'll just call them a nationalist. And well, there's some truth to that. Again, that is not what they are. They're not, they're not like the Scottish National Party, for example, or the Sinn Féin Party in Northern Ireland, which have a much stronger nationalistic focus. And while the Conservatives perhaps would like to have that kind of focus in a way, but they are keenly aware that they're meant to be unionist, not a single issue type nationalist party. There's quite an argument for saying that perhaps the Conservatives are promoting a form of kleptocracy, the way that they're undermining democracy and the way that they're funneling power and money to a smaller group of powerful, influential and wealthy individuals. That's an argument that can be made, but the UK is not like Russia yet, so kleptocracy, there's shades of it, but perhaps not a full transition yet, you might say. And there's another description that can also be applied, and it's going to make people very uncomfortable: National Socialist. Now, this is a political category that is very specifically applied to the Nazis. Now, I'm not going to be, advocating that the Conservatives are the new Nazi party. That is not what I'm saying. Certainly in terms of ideology, I don't think there's any case to say that the Conservatives are anti-Semitic, believe strongly in the white Aryan race and any other nonsense like that. But what you do have to remember is that the Nazis, or the National Socialists, that's even party just before the Nazis came to power, was very much about being nationalistic, but also about being very focused on what would be considered social issues, the workers' rights and workers' abilities and their influence and so on. So, and some of the tactics used by the Conservative Party today, whether it's about employment, immigration and so on, do have a disturbing level of commonality to some of the techniques used by the Nazi Party in Germany back in the 1930s. So, for example, whenever you hear Boris Johnson say, we have the lowest unemployment rate ever, the counter-argument that's very easy to make is, well, so did the Nazi Party, but that's because they deported or locked up all the Jews, thus creating more employment for those that were left. That is not a policy anyone would want to advocate. Now, of course, the Conservatives have not done that, but they've done a variant of that by just strongly discouraging immigration. So by doing that, you create full employment. So the argument goes. So there's various techniques that they deploy that have some similarities to those that had been previously practiced by National Socialists. But again, I don't think they're an easy fit into this category. And of course, the most popular category, because no one else can think of what else to call them, is populist. And I think this is more applicable to Boris Johnson personally than to the Conservative Party as a whole. Boris Johnson gives me the impression of someone who will adopt any policy, whatever it is, if it makes him popular and keeps his hold on power. And that's not too controversial a statement. That's one made by many people. But the Conservative Party as a whole is not like that. To a certain degree they are. They're following Boris Johnson's lead. But they themselves have more strong ideological alignment, particularly to free market principles, for example, and the concept of the small state. And they will continue to pursue those policies regardless of how unpopular they are, in contradiction to how Boris Johnson operates. So in conclusion here, really, I don't think we can put the Conservative Party into any one of these categories. But we can say that a little bit of every single one of them can be applied to the Conservative Party right now. And that perhaps will make certain people uncomfortable in realising that. So my final remarks on this discussion. Right now, the UK government, led by the Conservative Party, is the most corrupt government that the UK has ever experienced. And they're most incompetent. They lurch from crisis to crisis at an unprecedented rate. So that isn't something people will want to label them as a category, as a political group in a way to try and distance themselves from that corruption and that incompetence. But the reality is that corruption and incompetence doesn't matter what your political alignment is. It applies if you are morally bankrupt, stupid, and a whole host of other things. And right now, the Conservative Party, particularly led by Boris Johnson, is demonstrating some monumentally bad behaviours. So whenever you're trying to understand their motivation for doing anything, I think you drive yourself crazy trying to think if they're, right-wing, socialist or whatever. It's easier to understand, well, they'll do whatever it is that suits their interest at that point in time, and to hell with the consequences. So just label them corrupt and morally bankrupt, and that's easier to get your head around. Also, another key thing to understand about the Conservative Party today is they're strongly pushing the politics of division and tribalism. And this is a very dangerous road to go down. Because the problem is that for the political parties opposing the Conservatives, they find themselves almost having to go further extreme, more divisive and even more tribal, as a means of trying to counter what it is the Conservatives are doing. Now, this sort of politicking is very old, goes all the way back to Roman times even, possibly even earlier than that. And it's very much geared towards creating an us and them mentality. You're trying to create a group of people that strongly align with you and will vote for you no matter what. And a lot of the messaging, a lot of the ways the Conservative Party behaves very much demonstrates this. It demonstrates that this is how they see they should conduct their politics. Now, traditionally this has been associated with quite right-wing, but actually it didn't really matter what the alignment is. It can be left or right. But what is clear, this is the politics that they practice. And the significant danger for anyone trying to oppose their politics and how they practice it is having to go even more extreme in order to differentiate themselves, in order to grab the attention. And that's the dangerous juncture that British politics is at right now. And my final commentary on this is that whatever happens next, whatever changes, whenever the Conservative government leaves office, which one day, presumably, they will do, there's no doubt that they will leave behind a significant legacy of upheaval. They have created some really disturbing divisions within British society. Those who identify as pro-Brexit, those who identify as anti-Brexit. And unfortunately as well, those who are very strong pro-Brexit are now perceived as quite racist or promoting racist policies because of the racist policies heavily pushed forward by the Conservative Party. They may argue that is an unfair political taint to put on them, but that is the reality of how they'll be perceived. There's also huge political changes. Parliament has been broken, democracy has been broken, how the electoral system works, and how Parliament holds the executive to account, the independence of the judiciary, all of that has been wrecked by the Conservative Party in their bid to remove barriers to them. And finally, but certainly not least, the economic damage of what they have done is enormous. I don't think people quite really grasp the full extent of this. But the UK is going to be suffering economically from what has happened for a long time to come. And so combine all of that, and it doesn't really matter whether you want to call the Conservative socialist or hard right or kleptocratic or national socialist or anything like that. This is what they leave. This is what they have produced for British politics. And that is perhaps how I would argue that people should identify them or categorise them. So I hope you found this video interesting and a little bit hopefully thought-provoking. I would welcome people's comments if you're able to better identify their political alignment than I have done, then I'd be interested to see that. But of course, a little bit of a gentle reminder that I know this sort of discussion can create strong emotions, so please do keep it polite and civil, which everyone has done so far, which has been excellent. So thank you very much, and please continue to do that. And if you enjoy this, then please do subscribe and like the video.